Hi, my name is Yahav, and I was born and raised as an Israeli and as a Zionist. During the past few years, I've gone through the process of questioning the narrative I grew up with regarding this land we live in and the people living on it. This process led me to learn more and more until I reached a place of solidarity with the Palestinian people and their struggle for liberation. As I became more active, I became less afraid to voice my opinion. Over time, I've become more outspoken regarding my politics on social media, and it reached people who were very surprised to hear my opinions. They asked if there were more people that share these opinions in my community, and were especially curious about what exactly happened that made me change my mind so drastically. Answering this question would take a long time, so I decided to create a podcast about it, where every episode is a one-on-one, heartfelt conversation with an activist who in one way or another supports the same cause as me. Each episode tells the story of a journey that one individual made that led them to be the activists they are today. Each of these people have their own unique path that I believe anyone can learn from. Whether you're a Palestinian or a Jew living here or abroad, or just anyone who feels strongly about the subject and wants to hear these voices. You're welcome to join me in this conversation and let me know what you think. My contact information is in the description of this episode, and it would be great if this could be an interactive platform to approach, discuss, and unfold more around these topics. I hope you learn as much as I did from these beautiful souls who I have the privilege to call my partners in building a better future for all people between the river and the sea. So for this episode, I want to introduce you to Merphie. She worked for Breaking the Silence for 5 years and is a student and youth educator for the Forum for Regional Thinking. She has a special talent at advocating for the Palestinian struggle and has been doing it on several different fronts with grace, respect, and a sharp sense of justice. Disclaimer, anything and everything she said during the interview is her personal opinion and does not represent any organization she's worked for. Enjoy the episode. So Merphie, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good to see you. First of all, let's start with one question. What is Merphie? What does that mean? That's not a name that I've heard a lot here.
Merphie is a nickname. My real name is Frima. Frima is a Yiddish name, which means like a pious woman. I'm named after my great-grandmother. And so Merphie, in Hebrew, the letters are interchangeable.
So you grew up in a religious family, I assume, because of the name.
Yes, it's very uncommon, even in religious circles. I grew up in a religious family in Jerusalem. My parents are Canadian, and I guess the household would be what you call modern Orthodox. And in Israel, Tzionut Datit, so religious Zionism.
So these are people that believe that the establishment of the Jewish state is the sign that the Messiah has come.
Yeah, so that would be relevant to religious Zionism as a whole, as a movement. I specifically grew up in a more liberal family in that regard. There are very few, but still some religious Jews in Israel who identify as Zionists but do believe in peace and a two-state solution and are not, I guess, part of the right-wing religious circles in Israel.
So that's the family that you grew up in?
Yeah.
And your parents came here when they were adults?
Yeah, they came as adults, just as they were starting off their family. So my oldest siblings were born in Canada and they came here. And then my parents became religious.
Oh, so they became religious after they came here?
Yeah, that was basically part of the process.
And how old are you?
Almost 28.
So tell me a little bit about the household that you grew up in, the environment, the upbringing, the education, all that.
So I grew up in Jerusalem, as I said, and I went to religious schooling, elementary school and high school. So like an all-girls school. And we grew up in a neighborhood that was largely ultra-Orthodox with a smaller community of modern Orthodox Israeli Jews. And actually, the neighborhood that we grew up in, Harnof, is built on the remains or the ruins or the lands of Deir Yassin, which was a Palestinian village before 48. And it's very infamously known for a massacre that took place there in 1948 against the Palestinian villagers. And it was very significant in the 48 war and in the Nakba because it basically caused a lot of fright amongst Palestinian communities. And so it led to, and this is also in the Zionist narrative of things, it led to a lot of villagers to flee from different places because they were afraid that the same would happen in their village. So it was actually quite a crucial point. I mean, not only because of the horrible massacre itself, but also because of the things that it led to in the rest of the war. And I'm mentioning that because it was very significant for me to understand that.
Which was when?
I mean, I guess I heard the name Deir Yassin come up when I was growing up, maybe the first time when I was like 12 or 14 or something.
Where, at school?
I think I came across it sort of like an online kind of map or like GPS program for like Israelis who want to hike in Israel. It's called Amud Anan, I think, or something like that. And anyway, they had different information on different sites. And I think my brother showed it to me once, and then this like window popped up and, said something about a Palestinian village. And then I can't remember how, but I joined a Zachot tour to Deir Yassin.
When you were 14?
Or like 15, 16, somewhere around that time.
Wow.
It was a very weird experience because it was like my neighborhood, but also just going on a tour with a bunch of left-wing activists and kind of uncovering these other places right around where I lived.
What did your parents think of that, of going to a tour like that at the time?
I don't think they knew. I just kind of like, walked out of the house and joined the group 15 minutes later.
And did that change something for you, hearing about what was there before the neighborhood that you live in?
Yeah, definitely. It was a really important turning point for me. And then when I was in high school, I was studying arts, and my like sort of final assignment, my final project in high school in the arts was a project kind of around Deir Yassin and around issues that have to do with war and conflict. And so I photographed some olive groves that were right outside our house, which presumably were planted when the village was still there. And there's some other sites around where we lived. There are still a few homes and buildings from the time of the village. So it was definitely a very kind of pivotal moment for me. And also getting to know the world of like the Israeli NGOs. So Israeli Jews who are talking about the Nakba, who are talking about the conflict, the occupation.
How did your school, your teachers and the kids that were around you react to this project?
So specifically that arts program was pretty elitist. So, those kinds of views were, I guess, appraised. So I got like 100, I think, on that final project. I actually think that artistically it wasn't so great. But so from pretty early on, I was, the leftist in every circle, whether it was high school or youth movements or other stuff that I did later on. It was just a part of my identity. I mean, it definitely created conflict and arguments and conversations, but
like what at home, what was the political kind of view?
I guess most of my family throughout those years, like my parents and my older siblings who, were already more politically aware, were somewhere kind of like center left. So liberal Zionists.
Which basically means that you acknowledge that there's an occupation, but that means the occupation started in 1967 and that the Nakba has nothing to do with the occupation.
I think there is definitely an acknowledgement that the Nakba is part of the story, but it's not the center of the political struggle or the political campaign. So the Nakba is a part of the past. It's something that we have to, that we may be ashamed of or that we have to apologize for, but it's in the past. So I think it's more an issue of like how people view these issues with regards to their responsibility or accountability. So the occupation is ongoing, and that's why it feels very urgent and immediate to people, and the Nakba is in the past, and it's not something that they directly took part in. And also, definitely, I think many liberal Zionists buy into this claim that sort of says, like, what happens in war is war, and displacement is part of war, and it's part of what happened in different places in the world and, during those years. And so kind of like, we're very sorry about it, but let's move on. And for people who, don't see themselves as Zionists or want to break open from that framework, or definitely Palestinians, the Nakba is a huge part of that. And military occupation is maybe just one form of the Israeli oppression.
So this was the discourse at home with your parents.
I don't think I had such in-depth conversations about these issues specifically. I mean, I think that for people who are still within those kind of liberal Zionist frameworks, dealing with the Nakba or studying about it, or, reading Benny Morris is kind of more of this like academic endeavor, and it's not so much an actual political statement or action in the present.
So where were there clashes in regards to you being, the leftist?
I mean, in high school, I was, I guess, more of an outcast in that regard. I didn't always bring, my political views so staunchly into those spaces. I was doing a lot of that stuff on my own and kind of felt like I had this own separate world, like going to protests or, educational tours. And I kind of had this like alternative path. And I definitely grew apart from a lot of my circles because of that. And I didn't know how to integrate that really into, tell people like, listen, I just came back from this tour of Hebron or East Jerusalem, and we have to talk about this. I didn't necessarily know how to do that at a young age. And then after high school, I went to a pre-military academy, Mechina, which is, most of these programs are very elitist, very patriotic, very Zionist, and encourage, it's sort of a year where people take time off to study and to volunteer and to do agricultural work, and it's very oriented towards kind of leadership roles within the army and afterwards within civil society. And I think there's a sort of facade of like pluralism and let's learn about all the different issues and listen to all sides. But obviously the starting point is very patriotic and very Zionist. And then in the military, or making the decision to go to the military was also a little bit conflicted, because on the one hand, I felt that would be my feminist act, is, to go to the army. And I grew up in the religious community, so it wasn't something that I had to do by law.
Because all the girls are exempt automatically.
Right. If you grow up in a religious background, or if you go to religious schooling, you don't have to serve in the military.
As a girl.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. As a female, and if the religious men do serve, other than ultra-Orthodox men, which is a different story. So I really wanted to go to the army, and that's why I went to this pre-military academy as well. But as that time got closer and my political views formulated more and more, it became more of a conflict for me. And at the end of the day, I did join the military. I enlisted, and I served in the occupied territories. And part of that was that was led by this idea that, if already I'm doing this, if already I'm going to wear a uniform, then I might as well kind of go to the occupied territories, to the occupation, and kind of try to be the good soldier, which is...
try to make it humane.
Yeah, say. I think I was aware that, even that notion was a little bit naive. So I did sort of have this understanding that the occupation is bad, from the root of it. But I sort of thought to myself, well, maybe it's good that there will be good people, in those places.
And throughout this whole time, were you still religious?
No. So it was basically a process that happened simultaneously, that I was rebelling against society, the religious society that I grew up in, and also Israeli society as a whole. So those things kind of came together. But I stayed very, I guess, spiritually connected throughout the years. And I went to different Jewish study programs, and it wasn't something that I completely disregarded.
Because I feel that in our kind of mainstream Zionist upbringing, and especially in the religious upbringing, the connection between Judaism and Zionism is so strong that you feel that if you're not Zionist or if you go against the Zionist norm, then you're being a bad Jew.
Mm-hmm.
So how does that work in all of these programs and all of these things that you did?
I think it took time for me to kind of put this into words, but pretty soon on, I think I found the Jewish humanist angles, whether it was reading Yeshayahu Leibovich and other Jewish scholars around issues of humanism and human rights, and maybe today we'll call it human rights, but in the past, kind of issues of war and conflict, and so at some point it was pretty clear to me that there shouldn't be a contradiction. I'm not like an observant Jew. I wouldn't claim that. I'm not, I don't keep kosher or keep Shabbat and things like that anymore. But when it comes to, I think, like the tenets of faith and a lot of, I think, the sort of philosophical ground to what I perceive as Judaism, I think the real contradiction is nationalism, is Zionism and occupation. But obviously it's very thwarted in Israel today. And yeah, you're definitely, if you're not a Zionist or if you're against the occupation, you're not only a bad Israeli, you're a bad Jew, which I think is really ironic because I really think it's the other way around. Sometimes I do kind of wish that I had more of that in my life.
More of Judaism tradition?
Yeah, like more practice.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, it definitely has to do with the community. And I think a big part of, why people are able to keep all those rules of Jewish law is because they have a community that they feel comfortable in, that they feel represents their values and that supports that way of life. And I think that even in very liberal and progressive Jewish circles in Israel, there will be discussion of occupation or of conflict or of human rights, but I never felt that it was really committed to the Palestinian cause. And that to me always felt like a little bit of hypocrisy. So it's very easy to sit in a Beit Midrash in a Jewish study center and talk about humanistic values, but if you have never stood by Palestinians in the West Bank protesting for their rights, I think there's a contradiction there. So I guess to get back to your question, I think for me, part of it was like understanding that there's not really a community that sees those issues as coexisting.
I'm going to go back to your army service. What was your job? What did you do there?
So I was a soldier in the civil administration. It's basically the bureaucracy that manages the occupation, manages Palestinian daily life in the occupied territories. And there's different things that this unit does. I mean, one of the main things that it controls is Palestinian movement. So many soldiers in the unit, their 9-to-5 job is approving or disapproving Palestinian requests for permits to move from one place to the other, between the West Bank and Israel, between Gaza and Israel, even just to leave from the West Bank to go abroad. All of those borders are controlled by Israel, including, humanitarian cases of people who need medical treatment in Israel, or someone who perhaps passed away in Jordan and their family wants to bury them in the West Bank. So all that kind of thing of basically controlling Palestinian movement. And my specific role was in the operations room in Nablus. So there are different districts and different representatives of the civil administration in these areas. And the operations room is kind of more like everyday issues that come up. So it could be clashes with settlers, attacks of settlers on Palestinians and their sheep or their farmland and that sort of thing. And Palestinians could, at least in terms of the framework, they could file a complaint, so to speak, to the civil administration. And our job was to inform the army headquarters and get the police to go there and document. That doesn't mean that anyone will actually be arrested or that justice will be done, but that's how the system operates. And also coordinating between Palestinian security forces and the Israeli military. So in order for the Palestinian Authority to function under the boot of the Israeli military, it basically needs approval for everything that they do. So like, I don't know, I ended up doing kind of bizarre things, whether it was like coordinating electricity construction on, main highways in the West Bank, coordinating the movement or the transfer of Palestinian high school examinations from one city to another, ensuring that the Palestinian prime minister is not arrested or stopped on the way from his house to his office in Ramallah. All kinds of things that, from our perspective as soldiers in the civil administration, were like ensuring the rights of the Palestinians and making sure everything works diplomatically. Obviously, Palestinians have a very different experience of this. This is the body that is in charge of controlling their lives. But just to give maybe the listeners some insight, like for a lot of soldiers who are issuing these permits, their sense of it is they feel like they're on the wrong side. They feel, why is this my day job in the army? Like, why am I, giving these rights, so to speak, to Palestinians? And there's a lot of like disregard and kind of like looking down on soldiers in the civil administration. Like, you're on the bad side, like you're aiding the enemy. Kind of thing.
Like from the rest of the army.
Yeah.
To the soldiers in the civil administration.
Yeah.
Like, you're the lefties
that
are helping Palestinians, that's so ironic, because the Palestinians would see the civil administration as like the occupation.
Yeah,
basically.
it is the occupation. But because Israel, wants to maintain some sort of, facade of diplomacy and of ensuring human rights, then it does, some things to maintain. Again, this is the army's perception of what it's doing, to maintain normal routine of life for Palestinians under occupation. So for other soldiers within the army who are, let's say, arresting Palestinian youth in the middle of the night, it seems very bizarre that their fellow soldiers are granting Palestinian permits to go to hospitals in Israel. But in terms of the international community, it's the very, very bare minimum that Israel is required to do.
I don't think it would even be the bare minimum. I think it would be the logistics of this psychotic operation unfolding in the details of it.
Right. Like, exactly. Yeah. So one thing that I always like emphasize in this regard, like if I'm speaking to Israelis about these issues, is that like there are over 100 different types of permits, whether it's a work permit or a permit to go to a hospital in Israel, or a permit to visit family in Israel, or a permit for Christians in Gaza to visit Jerusalem when the Pope is visiting. All these detailed intricacies of various types of permits. And a lot of Israelis view that as, oh, look how generous we are, right? Because we're giving the Palestinians the right or the ability to do all these things. But obviously the irony is as you said, it's just an example, or it's just a display of how detailed and how deep this control is.
It's kind of like the irony of the checkpoints. In Hebrew, you can either call them מחסום, which obviously every Palestinian knows this word in Hebrew, which means a blockade, literally. And then the army, they call it ma'avar, which means a passage. So the army sees these checkpoints as, well, we built a wall and we're so generous that instead of just having this wall all closed, we're putting several passages every few kilometers so that people can go in and out.
Right.
By the way, mostly settlers. And the view of it as a passage instead of viewing it as a blockade, which is what it really is, because it shouldn't have been there in the first place, is just so crazy. It's like, why are we calling these passages? They're not passages. They're blocking people's ways. They're not opening ways for them. Like,
yeah, it's there's a lot of mindfuck in specifically in the civil administration's propaganda. It's really hard stuff to watch and to listen to.
And did you see this while you were serving, or these things that you came to these conclusions much later on?
yeah, was definitely aware of this stuff, while I was there, which made it a really excruciating process or experience.
Especially because you chose it. You could have been exempt.
Right. And so I knew I wasn't going to change anything deep within the system, but I sort of thought that, I mean, there were moments where I thought to myself, okay, like I am doing my best and maybe it's a little bit better than if someone else was on the shift.
Like you care a little more, so maybe this person got the permit instead of not getting it. Just
Yeah,
because this
or
person,
like maybe this person got a faster response that said that their permit is denied, but obviously it's not anything significant, and it's not something that's going to rewind 50 plus years of occupation. And it's, there were moments where Palestinians, they could call the phones in the operations room. So it's kind of like a civilian hotline. Again, this is the soldiers' perception of this whole apparatus. And oftentimes Palestinians who I spoke to were like very grateful, that I didn't hang up on them or that I gave them, just a very simple answer to a question that they had. But that made it all the more, I think, painful because it just felt very uncomfortable.
like the default is much worse.
Yeah, and also just being in that position where Palestinians are thanking me for, being decent and not being really horrible. And just how much dependency that creates, right? You need to just hope for the grace of the occupier to give you a simple answer as to how to go about, how to get a work permit, how to visit your family, how to do all these basic human things that,
They shouldn't even be asking you to do.
Right.
At the end of the day. Wow, that does sound excruciating.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not, obviously the victim in this story, but it was very, very, very unpleasant to be in that situation. And, also I didn't want to get in trouble. I didn't want to get punished for doing something against the rules. So most of the time I was doing things that I was really staunchly against.
Do you regret this?
I don't know. I think like the politically correct answer would be to say that I regret it, but I think the human experience is like a little bit more complex than that. And I personally don't relate so much to this concept of regret in general. I don't know. People might hear that and think like, oh my God, even more so fucked up. Like, why don't you regret it? Like if I wasn't there, someone else would be there. And again,
just like the Yaakov the settler. Remember that video that went viral?
If I don't take your house, someone else will.
The thing is that what's amazing about what he said is that it's so true.
Right.
Like he might be perceived as like the villain that's a deceitful, liar, horrible person, but the truth is it's not about him. It's about the system, because if he's not there, there will be someone else instead of him. And that's actually what they do. In that specific, I mean, generally in the Zionist project and the military and also the settler project, the people in Sheikh Jarrah are not families. Mm-hmm. The Jewish settlers are not families. They're young,
just single people.
Just single people that are kind of doing their shifts there, mm-hmm. sitting in that house so that the Palestinians that actually own it don't come back to reclaim it. And it's like, that's basically the essence of the occupation, is that you can just use civilians as pawns, and it's not really a matter of decision. I mean, obviously, if none of the Jewish Israelis took part in this and were willing to be cooperative with it, then the whole story in Sheikh Jarrah wouldn't have happened, initially. But once it starts happening, it really isn't about the individuals.
Yeah. I mean, I think there is a fair claim to say that, first of all, each and every one of us has their moral responsibility or their ethical accountability. And so I do think that I know that I was part of the occupation, and I was an active part of many people suffering. But I think, it just sort of more of like a philosophical position that I have about regret and about individual actions. And I think that perhaps without that, I wouldn't be able to be an advocate for the things that I am today.
Because you've seen it from up close and you know all the details of, how much this occupation is ridiculous. That's what you're saying? Or
Yeah, and I think, I mean, for many years, that's like what I did is try and use my experience and the things that I saw to try and shift the minds of Israelis, Jewish Israelis, against the occupation. So it's not that like I'm saying, oh, good, I went to the army and I was part of the occupation so that I could later speak out about it. But, given that that was the situation and the choices that I made at 17, 18, I think that, it's the least that, could have come out of this.
so you did 2 years of army service that you finished. What kind of feeling? What were your feelings when you got out?
I was very angry. I mean, maybe this just has to do with being a young person.
Who were you angry at?
I don't know. I think I was angry at, I directed the anger that I had in my mind towards the people around me. So a lot of the people that I, was encountered throughout my military time. Yeah, I think instead of kind of being angry at myself, I had a lot of moments where I was like, I can't believe they did that, or what a horrible thing to do. But at the same time, I was also there and I was also part of it. Just sort of like a general anger. It wasn't a specific anger like, oh, my teachers didn't tell me or something like that.
And what did you do next?
Shortly after, I mean, I had a few months in between that I traveled and worked a little bit. But then I joined Breaking the Silence, which maybe some of the listeners have heard of. It's an organization of veteran soldiers who've served in the occupied territories and who speak out against the military occupation by sharing testimonies of specific practices and specific, incidents that they took part in. And so there's a ton of educational work that this organization does, and that's what I did for almost 5 years. I did educational work with many Israelis, but mostly with Jews in the diaspora and international crowds, guiding tours to the West Bank and showing people the reality of the occupation and giving talks and lectures about what this military occupation looks like. And I think it's a really important angle for especially Jews in the diaspora and Israeli Jews who kind of need that validation of someone from within, someone who's like them, to tell them, listen, it's actually as bad as people are saying, and I need you to believe me that this is what's actually happening, and that it's possible, I think, to not, your identity or kind of your faith doesn't have to be completely shattered. You can learn about this and be active on the issue, and you don't have to completely ignore it or deny it.
Or you don't have to give up your identity either.
Yeah.
You can still be Jewish, you can still be a believer, you can still be traditional, you can still be whatever you want and resist these things.
Yeah. I think the pressure is even stronger for Jews in the diaspora in many ways, because they don't have that validation or that legitimacy of being Israeli.
Definitely.
So if you give up on your Zionism, then the question is even bigger. The hole or the gap is even bigger, because in some circles at least, because Judaism, kind of conformist Judaism in the U.S. is so intertwined with Zionism.
Yeah.
Israel education at every synagogue, every preschool.
For many people, it's also the main part of their Jewish identity. So if they gave that up, what's left?
Right, exactly.
That's a struggle that people have.
Right, and Israel is the place where they connect to their Judaism. They come here, they go to the Western Wall, they study Jewish texts, they're immersed in Jewish life here. So it's a hard one, but I think that as an Israeli, I feel that is my main responsibility, is to speak to people of my kind.
And when did you kind of go from being leftist and anti-occupation to distancing yourself from Zionism as an ideology? Because that's a shift that maybe not everybody knows is maybe one of the more radical shifts someone could make as a Jewish Israeli. Because there's a lot of Jewish Israelis that call themselves leftists, but at the end of the day, they still believe that Zionism is their, like ideologically is their home. You can't move them from there. Like they're not gonna budge because it's too scary.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's really one of the hardest things ever to do as an Israeli. And I don't know that I'm necessarily at the end of the process. I feel like it's a really, really long process. Like if becoming aware of human rights violations in the West Bank, can take you just a day. Someone gives you the right information and, shows you around and you meet Palestinians and you hear their experience. Challenging the Zionist kind of, not so much even just the factual kind of history of it, but like the place that it takes up in your identity and in your psyche, I think it is really, really radical. And I first of all think that it has to do with like really willing to be nonconformist, not just because it's like a cool thing to say, but it really means distancing yourself from this kind of automatic loyalty to this idea of a national collective or whatever. And I think it was somehow always there. Like today, I think after like a decade of, let's say, political involvement, I look back at like Deir Yassin in that moment where I realized that the place that I live in, that there used to be Palestinians there. And I think more than the massacre itself, it was the fact that there was life here. There was this community and that they had rituals and culture and religion and language and community and all these things. And it has to do with a lot of things. It also has to do with realizing that the two-state solution is a continuation of that framework. It's a framework based on separation. It's a framework based on
supremacy as well.
Supremacy and unequal division of the land that today, Jews are a slight majority in, but when the idea of partition initially came up, Jews were a minority in Palestine. And so I feel like disengaging from that idea, and for a lot of people it was a matter of, is the two-state solution viable? And then when it was no longer viable, you had this opportunity, like, spatially viable because of the settlements, etc. Then there was an opportunity to even think of the framework itself and where this idea of partition and separation came from. And also I don't know, I give a lot of credit to Palestinian scholars and Palestinian activists whom I encountered, who just have a completely different language about this place. And when you don't want to be separate from Palestinians and you're thinking of ways to live in this land, to share this land and to share life in general, then you're just not attracted to these ideas of supremacy anymore. It's like this kind of, I don't know, it kind of feels like a snake taking off its skin, in the sense that like Zionism is a whole set of kind of like discourse, and an approach to human life. And at some points in I think in my like journey, it was more simple. It was just like, okay, like I don't believe in nation states, right? And then so why should Jews have a nation state? And how should Jews still be safe in this world? And what kind of communities do I want from my Jewish community? But it also has to do with kind of more of like a historical inquiry of what this project was and the way that it treated really anyone who wasn't an Ashkenazi Zionist from Eastern Europe. The internal racism within the Israeli Zionist system towards Mizrahi Jews and Jews from I would say the East or from Arab-speaking countries, but really anywhere, anything,
or from Africa, or from anywhere that's
anywhere that's not that Ashkenazi hegemony. And so then you start to understand that this thing is not so great. And I also, it's important for me to say that it can be separate from the idea of a homeland for the Jewish people.
That was just what I was going to ask you. Because there's two main reasons why a Jew would feel that they should be here. One is safety, and the other is a historical connection or a spiritual connection to this land specifically, which is why the idea of a nation state for the Jewish people could not happen in any other place in the world. But how do you feel about that? Like the idea of the connection, the historical connection to this land?
I feel very connected to it. I mean, I assume that if I wasn't born here, it would have felt different. And I acknowledge that. And I think that's also an important piece, especially if we look at like other conflicts / other occupations around the world. I mean, I think there is an important piece that needs to be figured out, which is the occupiers or the settlers' connection to the land. Like, I think it's just, it oftentimes feels like it just conflictual. Like it sort of feels like, oh, it's not the right time, right? Like we should be first
Liberating from
fighting,
oppressing.
liberating, whatever.
Yeah.
And then, ask ourselves questions of identity and what kind of society we want to form here. But I think we have to answer those questions as soon as possible, because that's what keeps Jews away from being able to imagine a one-state situation, right? Because they fear that they won't have a place, that they won't be able to live out their connection to this land. And there is a connection. I think this is not, Boers in South Africa. Like, Jews have a very deeply rooted historical and religious and spiritual connection to this place. And I think it's important to cultivate that, like to intentionally separate that from ideas of supremacy, and to cultivate that as an alternative to Zionism.
I so much agree with that. I really feel like we have been indoctrinated to think that a connection to this land equals the exclusive sovereignty on it and military oppression, and it doesn't have to be like that. Like, the sovereignty can be shared. And there's so many alternatives to this situation that has been created, but people they kind of can't afford to see the alternatives because of the fear.
Right.
I feel like that's the only thing that's preventing them from seeing it.
And Zionist indoctrination that, among other things, intentionally distance people from their traditions and from their Jewish customs and their various Jewish dialects. So if you're not, I mean, you probably get this experience a lot. Like, a lot of the people that we know, I know that you grew up in, somewhat of a like traditional or conservative upbringing, perhaps not Orthodox, but
yeah.
A lot of the people that we know that grew up in secular households and communities, they have zero connection to their Jewish identity, but that's the reason that they justify their existence here. So there's this weird situation where they're Zionists because they're Jewish, but they don't actually, excuse my language, give a fuck about Judaism, which is fine, which is people's, it's definitely their right. But I think that it's also important to acknowledge that this was an intentional act of essentially a secular project. And then people they do really feel that they have an identity crisis if they let go of Zionism, because there's nothing to fill that void.
Yeah.
One thing that came up when we were talking about this idea of sharing land and how we view the land and, spirituality versus atheism, I think is this idea. There's a religious practice that, if you have a book and you don't want it to get lost, or so you write your number and your name in it. And a lot of religious people will write on their belongings, they'll write their name and their number, but they'll also add a quote, which I believe is from Bible, from Psalms, which says, "L'Hashem ha'aretz umlo'a," which means to God is the land and the earth in its fullness. And I think that in order to connect to this project of, conquering and occupation and dominance, then you have to be without a God, because nothing belongs to us. And I think that's why it's such a secular idea, because it's reclaiming the idea of governance, it's reclaiming the idea of power, of control. And although I don't agree, for many reasons fully with the ultra-Orthodox philosophy about this, but there's a certain softness that the ultra-Orthodox Zionists have maintained, which is this kind of like anti-militaristic and anti-power approach.
It's more like if we pray enough, then we will be sovereign on this land.
But God is sovereign, and God will decide, and yes, and in the future there will be some sort of like, Messiah and Jewish kingdom, etc.
But we're not going to be able to control it.
Right, but in practice, that Messiah is not going to come, and they're willing to live the rest of their lives, generations upon generations, without seeking that dominance. And it becomes a philosophy, it becomes a way of life to say, I don't own this place, I don't own this land, I don't own anything. So how could I claim to control other people, right?
Yeah, or control other people's land.
Yeah.
It's so what you're saying is this practice with these books is like, how can I even say that I own this book? This book is owned by God as well. That's basically that practice. I just wanted to clarify that.
It's just an example, but I think it's a very beautiful quote, and it's something nice to practice. I think our biggest fear is like that if we do that, then we'll be distanced from the community. But I don't feel that. I feel that the more I'm kind of confident in like what is justice in my eyes here, I think it's easier for me to say these things and to identify as like non-Zionist or anti-Zionist or whatever it is.
And like still feel like you belong here.
Yeah. And it just kind of feels like a very simple truth. And the more, as time goes by, I don't know, I can point to a specific moment. And I also just want to say that there's activists who are doing like so much more work than I am and who are like on the ground every day, all the time. And I just feel the need to say that because, activist guilt, I haven't been doing so much of that lately. But yeah, I guess it's just kind of like, if what motivates you is justice, this is a just cause. Every national or like liberation movement has its faults and has its issues, but I just sort of feel like being an ally to that makes most sense.
A lot of Jewish Israelis and Jews at large actually are very afraid of a one-state solution or anything like that, anything that gives equal rights to everyone who lives here, because they feel like once Palestinians are given the opportunity, or once they are a majority, or once they have some kind of equal control of this place as much as we Jews do, then they will either get revenge or will just gradually go back to being the Jewish minority oppressed like we've always been throughout history. What do you think about this innate fear that I feel like it sits in every single heart of every Israeli, no matter how leftist?
Yeah. I guess there's like two pieces to that.
I guess my question is, do you trust Palestinians?
I trust the Palestinians I know. I don't trust Palestinians because they're Palestinians. I trust people if I know them, I believe, I mean, this is going to sound a little bit, I don't know, poster-like, but I believe in democracy and I believe in equal rights and I believe in justice. I believe in all those things, and that's what I want to see. And if I were living in any other country that was not living up to those values, then I would presumably fight for those values. And so perhaps this is, what other people might think is naive, but that's what I'll continue fighting for in whatever constellation I'm living in. And I think the fear is also, is wrapped up in this idea of it has to do with the religious Islamic ideology or approach to this place and to Palestine. And I think it's a legitimate fear, and I think it's a valid fear, and it's also a fear that a lot of secular Palestinians have about the future of the society and the governance, but I just don't see dominance as an answer to that. Like, if it's Jewish dominance or Palestinian dominance over Jews, I just yeah, that's not what I want to see. So whatever the situation may be, does that make sense? As in, I'm striving for and hopefully fighting for a just society.
Whether you're the majority or the minority.
Yeah. Maybe it's easier to do that as a majority. I don't know. And maybe that's the fear of many Jews, is that they will become a minority. But I think that's inevitable anyway. I mean, you can't fight the demographics. Like, Jews are going to be outnumbered by Palestinians at some point, or at least Zionist Jews in this land. And so I think, that it's... I trust humanity, and I believe in, like, maybe it's kind of like old school democracy, but I believe that if people have a good life and they have good education and they have good healthcare and they have, all their freedoms are protected, I think that it usually tends to create, respect and dignity and like good things.
See, where I disagree with that is that I know a lot of Israelis that have all of that, but they still support an apartheid regime. I mean,
yeah, but they don't have that because
of the trauma of being persecuted as Jewish people.
The saying goes, none of us are free until all of us are free. And I really think that, like, it may just sound like a slogan, but I really think that Israelis are not free because they're not, because they live in a society that is not free for half of the people who live under its regime. So we may feel like we do enjoy Jewish democracy for Jews, but it's not a democracy.
Even for some Jews, it's not.
Even for some Jews, and for Palestinians living under the Israeli government system, directly, and those who are living under its occupation. So yeah, I mean, maybe this sounds like we haven't tried real capitalism or we haven't tried real communism, but I really think that we haven't tried real democracy and real equality. And I think, that goes both ways. I believe that it changes people's perception of, their need to control. I don't know. I just believe that true justice will bring a sense of security to everyone here.
Is there anything you'd like to add that I haven't asked you about? Any message to the nations or to your nation?
Well,
specifically?
Who's listening?
I hope as many people as possible, but we'll see about that later.
What's my message? Take care of yourselves. Yeah, no, like life is hard. Being in political activism is really hard, and community is important, and family is important. And I guess maybe just to sum up some of the things that we spoke about, I don't feel, it's not even that I don't feel a contradiction. I actually feel closer to my Jewish identity the more I become involved in, various Palestinian struggles. And I really encourage people to feel safe enough in that, in that space. And also, I think that because mainstream Jewish community didn't address these issues, and I felt like I had to flee these kind of more traditional spaces. Now that I chose my political community, I can like live up to my spiritual identity as well in Israel, and I think unfortunately in the diaspora as well. In many places, if you're part of the Jewish community, as we said, then you're also Zionist, and you're also, you can't be too critical of what the Israeli state does. And once you release yourself of that, I feel like I can really re-embrace Judaism in a way that feels very healthy and like clean and pure in a way that it should.
I connect to that very much. Anyone who wants to follow Merphie or Frima, you can do so on Twitter.
I'll just say disclaimer that I've been really low on social media lately.
No, but you've got an amazing Twitter. I like your account.
Maybe it'll be a lot of like retroactively, but maybe in the future I'll get back to it.
So if you want to hear a little bit more about what Merphie thinks, follow her on Merphie _B, which is her handle on Twitter. Anything else you want to recommend? Just something to look up, someone to follow that you think would be very influential on listeners?
So I guess I can just recommend, I don't know who the listeners are, but if they're also Israeli or Jewish and seeking resources to understand the Palestinian narrative, and I would also say kind of more academic and theoretical frameworks for some of the envisioning that we spoke about. I really learned a lot from Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. So thank you to them for influencing my positions. And I guess those who are not Israeli and not Jewish, I think that the Israeli human rights organizations and NGOs are doing very important work. So I can just always recommend to check out their work also if you just want to be involved in things that are happening
Like who?
on the ground, like Breaking the Silence, like B'Tselem, Gisha, Yeshdin.
There's also Zachot, which you mentioned in the beginning.
And I think Zachot is maybe the most interesting of them all in their envisioning of a future and not only focusing on the, here and now. And so Zachot took an interesting turn from being a kind of research and data and historical documentation of the Nakba to being recently, or in the past few years, there has been a circle of Jewish Israelis formed, Jewish Israelis who commit to the idea of Palestinian return and to decolonizing the space. And I think that's a really interesting vision for the future.
Yeah, me too. And I like that Zachot are very connected to the transitional justice kind of theory. And I think that that's the ultimate solution to what's going on here is transitional justice, because transitional justice, it not only brings justice to the oppressed, but it also creates a framework where the oppressor can go through a process of transitioning in a safe space to become a partner instead of an oppressor. And I think that, if that process doesn't happen, then we just end up with, South Africa that's might not be in apartheid on paper right now, but still has like heavy issues to deal with. Like I feel there's a lot of work to do to really bring a really joint future, like without violence and without oppression, without supremacy.
זהו? או שנגיד עוד דברים?
זהו,
קשה.
thank you so much for coming and speaking to me, Merphie.
Thank you so much for hosting. This was it was really nice. I haven't spoken about these issues in quite a while. And it was really nice. Like I felt with you like reconnected to how strongly I feel about these issues.
Yes. I'm very happy to hear that. And I hope me and you keep rocking in the free world together and creating justice and peace from the river to the sea.
From the river to the sea. Amen.
Yeah. Yalla, bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So that's it. Thank you so much, Merphie, for joining and sharing. Thank you, Roy Geva, for the beautiful music that he composed for this podcast. And thank you for listening.